Hey everyone, welcome back to the garage. We're going to continue work on my 1989 BMW E30. The focus of today's video is to refresh the entire suspension system on this car. That includes shocks, springs, bushings, and the whole lot. Now I do apologize for not getting a video out more frequently, but unfortunately the weather we've been encountering around this area has just been absolutely terrible. We're talking Fahrenheit temperatures in the single digits, including the negatives, with lots of wind, snow, ice. It's just been really terrible to try and even work in the garage, let alone do things outside. But I'm doing my best getting these things on the car in this video. So before we start taking things apart on this car, let's go ahead and look at the parts that we have to go back in it. All right, so the first box of parts we have right here are H&R lowering springs. These are the OE Sport springs for the rear-wheel drive BMW E30. You'll notice there's two different colors. These are the rears in this gray color, and then this kind of navy blue are the front springs. Now these springs are supposed to lower the car about 1 inch. Currently the car is lowered, I don't even know how much. It's way too much. You can notice all that super negative camber in the back, and even on the front, it's just almost too low to even slide a jack under. And I'm not all about that sort of thing, so we're looking to actually raise the ride height of this car with these springs. Not only just raise it, but make sure all four corners are actually equal. Because I'm pretty sure the springs that are in this car right now have actually collapsed at different rates, and even the driver's side sitting lower than the passenger side. So these new springs should bring everything back up to equal balance so that we can actually set a good alignment on this car. Now, moving down the line, I've got new spring holder rubber gaskets. These go on in the top and bottom of the strut housing. Down here, we'll see we have brand new Bilstein shocks. So these are the B8 shocks, not the HD, but these are the B8 shock absorbers and strut cartridges for the BMW E30. These are for if you're lowering your car at all. So even though I'm just dropping it an inch, I'm still gonna put the lowered style struts and shocks on this car. And that's because when you have a lower spring, your shock absorber needs to have a shorter breadth of dampening range. So the shafts right here are actually shorter than the stock shafts would be, which means when you raise the car, the suspension droop won't be nearly as much. Now these are pretty high quality struts. Altogether for the kit, it was about $460 or something like that. So I mean, it's not cheap, but hopefully they'll last a long time. Not only will they ride better than what's currently in there, but they'll also look great when you take a look under the car. Moving down the line here, these are the top shock mounts for the rear shocks. These bolt into the rear wheel well. So also right here, I've got a shock mount reinforcement kit from ECS Tuning. It consists of an aluminum brace that goes on the top side of this mount so that it just prevents flexing of the wheel well where this mounts to, and potentially reducing the cracking that might occur should you encounter a huge bump or something like that. All right, so moving further down the line here, we've got firstly in this box a new strut hat for the top. So the strut actually goes through the middle of this, and when you turn the steering wheel, that strut turns as well, and it's allowed to do that because of this bearing at the top of the strut mount. So it would go into the car like this, and you see those three nuts when you open the hood. That's what this piece is. So this is isolated with a rubber piece inside of here, so if you ever go over a bump and you hear some nasty rattling or something like that coming from the front suspension, often it's something wrong with this piece. So we're gonna go ahead and swap that out for new. I've also got new sway bar links for the front and rear. So this is a rear sway bar link, and then we have the front sway bar links. We're gonna go ahead and swap these out. I've also got new sway bar bushings for the front here, and then over here I've got new control arm bushings for the lollipops. I'll have to press out the old ones and press in the new ones into those metal lollipops. And then lastly over here we have brand new control arms. They have new ball joints for the inner and outer. Now I don't know that anything's actually wrong with the ones that are in the car, but I figure if I'm putting all these new parts in there, it might be just foolish to not go ahead and replace those and make sure everything is just fresh and ready to go. So that is a summary of all the parts we'll be dealing with on today's video. Now before I jack the car up and start swapping out parts, I want to take a measurement of how low the car is right now so we can use that as a baseline for when the new springs are put in. We can see how much the car was raised up. So let's start taking some measurements with a tape measure. All right, so what we're gonna do is find 2 reference points to measure from. We don't really care about the ground clearance. That's not what we're measuring. What we're doing is just creating a baseline from 2 reference points so we can capture with the old springs what the distance between these 2 reference points are, and then what the distance between the 2 reference points are with the new springs. So the 2 reference points I'm going to use are the inner portion of the wheel right here compared to an approximate perpendicular upwards position along the wheel well, and that's about centered Well, we're just getting an estimate here, really. So that is 9 5/8 inches right there between those two reference points. So with that information, I'm going to write it down on a piece of paper so I can remember it and reference that when I go back to install the new springs. Now let's move around the rest of the car. That's 8 1/4 for that wheel arch. That gives us 8 1/2 inches. So we can already tell between the left and right side on the rear, we've got a 1/4 inch difference. The left side is drooping a 1/4 inch more than the right side. And lastly, that's 9 7/8 right there. Okay, so with our measurements taken, I've made a diagram here so that we can document what those measurements are and compare them against the new measurements with the new springs. So we can see that on the left side we have 9 5/8 inch for the front and 8 1/4 for the rear. On the right side we have 9 7/8 for the front and 8 1/2 for the rear. So the left side, front and rear, is a 1/4 of an inch lower than the right side. So I assume this is just attributed to the driver always being on the left side. Therefore, the left side springs took more wear than the right side. At least that's my hypothesis. What I really hope I don't find is when I install the new springs, this 1/4 inch difference still exists. But we're gonna find out once the new parts are in there. Okay, so with our baseline measurements now taken, it's now time to start taking the old parts off and throwing the new ones in. We'll start off with the front end of the car, just because it's more difficult. If I run into anything wrong, it's gonna be at the front end. So let's just take it on and get done with it. Let's get to it. So I just finished putting together the final strut and I came across an unfortunate problem. Let's take a look. So here's the final strut, completely assembled. All the components are tightened down and ready to go. But as I was getting to remove this thing from the vise, I found something very unfortunate, and it has to do with the new strut hat right here, the strut mount. So inside of this is a bearing that allows the whole strut assembly to turn when you turn the steering wheel. But it's supposed to be a very tight assembly with no sort of play other than the ability to rotate. Well, if you take a look at this, you can see I can wiggle this fore and aft and even in the Z-axis up and down. The whole point of replacing this assembly is so that you get rid of all of that play, because this sort of play translates into all sorts of rattles and knocks that you hear from the front end. So this is a brand new part, and I'm very disappointed that it's worse than the old one I took out. So this is made by Socks, and I thought that was a reputable company. I mean, the first one I put in was tight as a drum. It didn't have any of this problem. But here I am. I'm gonna have to remove this and order a new one. Of course, now I've gotta wait a week at least to get the new one in. I'm just very disappointed because, you know what, everything's ready to go, but I can't put this thing back in here with this part like that. So all I have to do is just order a new one and wait a bit. But even though I can't put this strut back in the car, I can attack the control arms and renew the bushings on those lollipops and all that. So I will do that instead. So with that bit of unfortunate news, let's go ahead and start in on redoing the control arms. So let's take a break real quick. I've had a bit of trouble trying to install these lollipop bushings for the front control arms. I actually, in the end, had to make up my own special tool to even get these things onto the control arms. Let's take a look. Okay, so the first hurdle was actually installing the bushings into the lollipop. To get the old bushings out, I just took a hacksaw and cut the outer steel perimeter and just banged it through with a hammer. So once the old bushings were out of the lollipops, to put the new ones in, I kind of defaulted to caveman type techniques where I just had a PVC pipe that was the same diameter as the lollipop, and then I used a socket that was the same diameter as the metal bushing and just used a hammer to basically press it in. In a perfect scenario, you would have a hydraulic press that would just push these in, but of course not everybody has those, especially not in your home workshop. So you can get these in there using just kind of a hammer and a socket. But the second layer of difficulty came when actually pressing these new bushings onto the control arm. I tried at first trying to use a hammer and a socket to get these things on there. Of course, that simply didn't work. I've heard people having luck doing that sort of thing. I just couldn't get that thing on there. So ultimately, I found this tip online of constructing your own press type mechanism. So this press type mechanism actually uses a gear puller, which I already had, and then some 3/8 diameter all thread, and then a 3/4 inch angle iron piece, which I've cut down to about 5 inches right here. So all I did was drill 2 holes for the 3/8 all thread to pass through, put some nuts on the bottom, then put some nut securing on the top, and then I put it's a 19mm socket that goes on this inner steel portion of this bushing, and then I just began ratcheting this down, and it pressed this bushing downward onto the control arm, and that worked. Now that I know how to do this, I can just apply that to the other control arm and probably have it done in less than 30 minutes. So save yourself a lot of time. Just go out and buy this stuff and make this press. So this is my first time ever installing these lollipop style bushings onto BMW lower control arms, and these are the things you just learn as you go. So now I know, and now I have this special tool, so if I ever need to do this ever again, it's ready to go. All right, so let's do the other side. so now the control arms are installed in the car, and through the power of editing, we're now a week into the future, and all of the parts that I ordered are now here. Let's take a look at them. All right, so the first thing we have here are 2 new strut mounts. So I only had one that was defective, but I went ahead and ordered 2 more just in case the 50% defective rate continued. So I've actually opened one of these boxes up already and looked at the strut mount, and the bearing in the middle of this is super tight. So I'm hoping installing this will be good and we won't have to open that second box. I can just send that back. Now, while I was ordering parts, I went ahead and ordered a few extra things. Now, the first thing over here is a special socket made by Schwaben. It's a 19mm one, and this is how you can actually tighten that top nut on the strut mount. As you can see, it has a cutout slot here where you can insert an Allen key to keep the inner portion of the strut stationary while you turn the nut and torque it to specification. Now, I wasn't using this before, I didn't have this tool, but now that I have it, I will now be able to apply the proper torque, which I think is 46 or 47 foot-pounds, I'll have to look. But anyway, now that I have this, I can now tighten that top nut to the proper specification. Again, it's made by Schwaben, and I'll put a link to it in the description of this video. Now, moving down the line here, we'll see that we have various pieces of rubber spacers. Now, these are OEM BMW parts. So BMW makes 2 sizes of the top front spring cushions. So the ones I installed on the shocks already are actually a thicker 9mm one, but the ones I took off of the car were these thinner 3mm ones. I didn't even realize there was a difference until I started taking them apart. So what I'll do, since I've got to reinstall a new strut mount anyways, I'll probably swap out for these thinner 3mm ones so that it matches the ones I took off. Now, the difference between these again are 6mm. These are the 3mm, the one I installed on there are 9mm. And what you have to understand is that there's not a simple ride height difference of 6mm between these two. So what we're actually doing is applying preload to that spring. What it means is we're increasing compression on that spring, and that when the cars drop down, you might see a ride height increase of more than 6mm just because that spring has more preload. So I'm hoping that when we put the original size back in there, we'll get the front and rear leveled out, because I've actually gone down here and ordered new rear spring pads as well. So if you remember in my previous videos when I changed out the rear subframe bushings, I actually installed these pucks under the rear springs to help increase the ride height. While it did increase the ride height a little bit, it wasn't enough. So as you can see in this video, I'm hoping to increase that ride height a lot by just putting new springs in there. So since I'm doing that, I'm just gonna go ahead and put the original size rear spring pads back in. I can't reuse the old ones because they've actually compressed quite a bit where the coil rests on this spring pad. You can see I've probably lost maybe 2 to 3mm alone just because it's old. So we've got the equivalent one, which is 7.5mm here, brand new. I've also bought new top spring pads as well, which has the bump stop in them. The old ones, again, have a depression in the middle, so that will, again, decrease ride height. So we're just gonna start completely fresh with new springs and new pads, and hopefully we can get a baseline ride height going. Now, in order to save time, I've actually gone through and ordered the other spring pad thicknesses that BMW offers. We have 5mm here, and then we have 10mm here, depending on what the ultimate ride height looks like with our baseline original spring pads. So if it's too high, I'll install these 5mm ones, and if it's too low, then I'll probably go in and install these 10mm ones. We'll just have to wait and see. But again, I just went ahead and bought all these things because I don't want to have to wait and get them in if I find out I need them in the future. All right, with the new parts reviewed, let's go ahead and swap out that front strut mount and also put in those new top spring pads. Let's get to it. All right, so that's the front end of the car now completely redone. Now it's time to focus on the back. Let's go. All right, so I'm gonna pause for an update. Unfortunately, I can't fit the new springs into the same gap that I pulled the old springs out of. Let's take a look. So right here, I've just unbolted the shock absorber and unbolted the sway bar link and undone the exhaust a little bit here to allow the swing arm to fully extend downward, which with the old spring was enough clearance to actually pull it out of here. But now that I've got these new spring pads in here and the new springs are a little bit taller, I can't actually fit them in there. Let's go over to the bench and see how the old springs compare to the new ones. So the old spring is at least 2 inches shorter than the new spring right here. And I don't know if the old spring started off that short or just over time it collapsed to that compressed size. But either way, I can't fit this new spring in there like I could the old spring. So to work with this newfound issue, I'm actually gonna have to cant the subframe downward. And I'm gonna do that by undoing the bolt that holds the back half of the differential in place. Once that bolt's out of the way, the whole subframe should kind of swing downward, meaning the trailing arms will come downward, giving me that extra 2 or so inches of clearance I need to get the new springs in. So before I do that, I'll have to undo the passenger side of the car, undo the shock absorber, sway bar link, and all of that so that the whole assembly can come downward. Let's get to it. So that took a long time, but I gotta say, it's completely finished now. New springs, new struts, new shocks, and new sway bar links, new control arms and bushings installed, and this car is now completely overhauled when it comes to suspension. There is one step remaining in this whole job, and that is to do a 4-wheel alignment on this car. Now, anyone familiar with E30s might be thinking, what are you talking 4-wheel alignment? You can only adjust the front wheels and only the toe at that. Well, actually, the previous owner of this car installed polyurethane eccentric bushings in the rear trailing arms, meaning that toe and camber can be adjusted a little bit. Now that's not something I can do myself. I'll need to take this to a professional alignment shop with a laser alignment so I can get it dialed in just right. That way the car handles well and predictable and everything's good to go. Now even though it needs an alignment, I wish I could go take it out on the street and just see how much quieter it is now that it's a little bit higher off the ground and that it has new shocks, struts, and new bushings in it, but unfortunately I can't because, well, the weather's absolute crap right now. Wow, wow. So even though I can't go drive it, let's take a look at the visual improvements that we see already. So without question, the car sits much higher. You can see in the back, you can actually see the top of the tire now, where before it was hidden beneath the wheel well. And then if you look at it from the side, you'll notice a considerable amount of negative camber has been removed. Now on the front, you can see it's been increased quite a bit there as well. So if you remember at the beginning of the video, I did take a measurement of the distance between this part of the wheel to the top of the fender on all four corners. And I've gone back through and remeasured everything. Let's take a look at my diagram to see what's changed. So this diagram's kind of muddied up, it's dirty, and it's kind of hard to read, but we can still discern what's going on here. So our first measurements for the front on the left side was 9 5/8 inch from that center point of the wheel to the top of the wheel arch. The new measurement is 11 1/4 inch, and that's a difference of 1 5/8 inches. So the car sits now in that corner an inch and 5/8 higher than it did before. On the left side and the rear, it was 8 1/4. Now it's an even 10 inches, which is an increase of 1 1/4 inches. On the right side, we had an 8 1/2 inches at the rear, and now it sits at 10 inches. And at the front, we had 9 7/8 inches, and now it sits at 11 1/4. So as you can see, the new measurements match exactly from left to right, front to rear. So in the front, both sides were measuring at 11 1/4, and in the rear, both sides are measuring at 10 inches. Overall, that's an increase in ride height of 1 1/2 inches about on all four corners. The most important aspect of this is, one, it's higher, and two, it's now level from left to right. So that is a huge improvement, and I'm very happy about that. Now I will say it was a little bit difficult to nail down the specifications of the spring pads, springs, and shock absorbers, and what all can fit together so that you get a leveled out car. So I spent all that time and money to figure that stuff out. So I'll make sure I put links to all those parts in the description of the video so you don't have to do all that research yourself. You can just click on those things, buy them, and get them on your car, and you will be happy with the results. So as you can see, the car overall is sitting level. There's no extreme rake towards the front end, which I've seen a lot of E30s have. Actually, this car is sitting pretty flat, so quite a result there. So I won't lie, this was kind of an expensive project. We're knocking on the door of about $1,400 with all the parts I had to order originally, and then the extra parts and tools that I had to order to complete the job. But you know what? If you want to do it right, you gotta spend money, unfortunately, in this game. Now when it comes down to the alignment, that could easily be another $100 to $200. So all in, we're looking at probably $1,500 to $1,600 to completely redo the suspension on one of these cars. I could have done it a cheaper way. I could have not put Bilstein shocks in there. I could have put the standard style shocks, but I figured if I'm gonna go in there, I might as well just put the nice stuff in. So that pretty much wraps it up for this video. In a future video, we'll take the car out for a spin after I get it fully aligned and ready to go. So hopefully the temperatures around here will warm up and we'll stop getting all this snow and ice so I can actually drive it and get a video out to you guys of how it's performing. So with that, I'd like to thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you guys again soon.